Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's 10 o'clock, so it is the time to start another one of our Thursday seminars. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Steve Fuller from the University of Warwick, but an American by origin.
My apologies.
Who is one of the leading and most provocative figures in the field of science studies, being quite critical toward this current situation in STS, Science and Technology Studies. Already in 1988, if I am not wrong, he founded the scientific journal called Social Epistemology, and thus also entire academic field of the same name.
Wrote the first book on it. Yeah.
Yes. He published about science, about universities and education, about the relationship between science and democracy, and lately also quite a lot about transhumanism.
That's right.
Today, however, he will talk about the principle of symmetry, which used to be quite lively discussion within the community, and he will surely offer a fresh
resurrected.
Yes. So please, Steve, the floor is yours.
Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me. This is, in a strange kind of way, it's a topic that's very close to me, even though I wasn't the one who recommended it. But it's true. So some of you who know something about my intellectual history, I'm someone who was very much involved in science and technology studies pretty much from the beginning, even as a graduate student. So I did my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in history and philosophy of science. And there were some of us who were kind of, you might say, transitioning into what was going to become science and technology studies back then. And so we're talking about the early 1980s. And so I remember, for example, at the Philosophy of Science Association conference in 1982, after I'd finished my PhD exams, right? There was Karen Canor-Cetina and Steve Woolgar and Harry Collins and Bruno Latour. All these people were actually there speaking at that time, right? Because this was kind of a big deal in 1982. And it was, Laboratory Life, Latour and Woolgar, 1979, David Bloor, 1976, Knowledge and Social Imagery, right? So the philosophers, in a sense, were already registering this, and I was part of that crew and got very much involved very early on. And even as I was writing my PhD, I was actually publishing in the field of science and technology studies. And in fact, back in 1993, I wrote a book called Philosophy, Rhetoric, and the End of Knowledge, which was very much highlighting what I thought would be the role of science and technology studies in kind of providing a sort of meta-discipline for knowledge generally, right? So actually being something like a kind of second order, maybe a professional school, but one directed at the university that would be able to, identify the shortcomings of disciplinary boundaries and stuff like that, because so much of what science and technology studies was doing was about challenging disciplinary boundaries as the basis for serious research. And I think I mentioned this yesterday talking to some of the guys here, that one of the distinctive features of the field of science and technology studies is it's never had an interest in education, right? It's always been about research. And from that standpoint, education is seen as the enemy, right? Because education reproduces disciplinary boundaries that are often established by quite contingent sociopolitical factors in a given country, right? So every country, in a way, divides the disciplines a little bit differently. And as a result, any kind of innovative, original research is kind of marginalized. And in a sense, science technology studies was partly a response to that. And that's why the kinds of places where science technology studies empirically did its work, which was the most interesting work, was in laboratories, right? Research places. Places that, in a sense, were more or less disconnected from teaching. And this has always been, I think, a great blind spot, in a way a strength, but also a blind spot in science technology studies. It's never taken education seriously, right? And so science technology studies has nothing to say about the university, okay? And see, I come from this, in a way, my understanding of knowledge, and this is because, I have an undergraduate degree in sociology and history from Columbia University before I got into this field. And really, we should be talking about knowledge, and how knowledge is produced and reproduced. And we should think of this as kind of a package deal, in a sense. It doesn't make sense to produce knowledge if you haven't figured out how to reproduce knowledge. And I would have thought a properly sociological approach to knowledge would incorporate both of those things. But science and technology studies tended not to really think that way. Science technology studies was basically how a rather indeterminate situation in a research or laboratory environment gets resolved in that setting, and then that resolution gets reproduced through the research culture, which usually means journal publications. And so science and technology studies actually has some very interesting things to say about journal publications. But that's different from what goes on in a classroom, okay? So that's part of, in a sense, that's kind of a shortcoming that I think, in a way, made science and technology studies very awkward as we moved on through the 1980s and 90s, where issues of education actually started to matter, right? In the West, we had this canon wars and culture wars and science wars, and those were primarily about how things were taught, right? They weren't about the cutting edge of research. They were about how things were taught. And science technology studies was, I actually contributed a lot to all this stuff, okay? So I was always one of the people who was very interested in the education and the university, and to this day, and if you follow my writings, you'll know this is true. And in fact, I actually think the education and university side of this is more important than the research sides. Because the research, see, let me tell you why I think this. It's because, in a sense, I really take seriously what Lyotard said in the Postmodern Condition. And one of the things that Lyotard says that I think is really important here is that if we're talking about where research comes from, it comes from outside the university. It's typically in the Bell Labs, right? All of these, all these labs that are funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, right? This is where, in fact, especially in the 20th century, where all the innovative research comes from. And then the universities have to play catch up. And then the interesting question is, how do the universities catch up under these circumstances? But it's a complete mistake to represent the universities as somehow a vanguard of innovative research. And this is where Lyotard is arguing against, people like Habermas. I don't know if people take Habermas seriously anymore, but Habermas was a big deal, actually, in the 1970s and 80s. And Lyotard was saying, look, this guy is just mythology, right? By making the university and academia as the place where, research really comes from. And you see, this is where you can start to see how science and technology studies is responding to the postmodern condition, right? Because Lyotard is saying, where the action is about knowledge is in the research sites. Now, I think that is not the complete story by any means, but it was a very useful corrective. This is the point I want to make about the 1970s and 80s. It was very useful to say to people in a very clear way that research innovation was not coming from the universities. They research that the universities are basically places to reproduce knowledge that has already been legitimized. Okay? And that was a really useful thing to point out in the 1970s and 80s. And that's why I was on Lyotard's side against Habermas. Okay. But then the question becomes, what becomes of the university? Does the university just disappear, or does the university learn from that experience? And the university itself becomes innovative, right? And that has been the hard problem. That's the hard problem of knowledge, of institutional knowledge, in the wake of science and technology studies. But science and technology studies is largely useless in solving that problem, right? Because the science and technology studies couldn't care less about the university one way or another. It's very indifferent, right? It just wants to see the sites of knowledge production wherever they happen to be. But the university itself is not one of the things they care much about. Okay, so this is kind of a prelude. And so there's a sense in which science and technology studies, I would say, in light of all the various canon wars, culture wars, science wars, all these things that have been happening for the last 30, 40 years, basically kind of drifted in the direction of societal trends. And so the kinds of knowledge they tend to focus on are the ones that are socially and politically correct or admirable or whatever. And in a sense, any kind of conceptual basis for the field has been abandoned. And the people who we would normally think of as being the founders or conceptual, founders of the field, the kind of people who I saw back in the 1980s, they're gone, or they've abandoned, as Elvis left the building, right? They've all gone, right? And they're nothing like science and technology studies people now. I mean, the one exception is Sheila Jasanoff, okay? I'll say something about her because she's an institution person, right? She's about institutions, if nothing else. And so the theory is kind of thin, but the institution commitment is strong. Right, so we hear about co-production, and you know her terms, right? They're kind of bullshit, right? But the point is that they can be used as a basis for solidifying institutions. So she kind of, in a way, has kind of kept a certain rhetoric of the field going, right, in the aid of solidifying institutions in science and technology studies, the contents of which could be just about anything. Okay. And I think that's kind of where the field is now. Okay. So to be honest with you, it was really promising 40-something years ago as an intellectual area. I don't think it's promising at all intellectually. I think it's, if you've got a department or an institute going, consult with Jasanoff to keep yourselves alive. But that's kind of what I would say. Okay. And so then the question becomes, well, what is intellectually interesting about this field? Because, if you think about it a different way, so in other words, we're not interested in keeping alive science and technology programs, and I've been part of those things. We're not really interested in that. We're interested in what's intellectually substantive about it that's worth kind of carrying on into the future in perhaps some other form, right? So we're, in a sense, in scavenger mode. Okay, we're looking around for what concepts, what ideas really matter. Okay, and this is why I mentioned the symmetry principle, because I think the symmetry principle is quite a valuable thing. And I think in a way, because it has this ideal combination of looseness and rigor. Right, it's a principle. There's a sense in which you could say it very easily, but then the way you flesh it out, right, could go in many different directions. And this is why I want to kind of push it in the direction of epistemic justice, okay, which I will say something about shortly. Now, the STS symmetry principle is due to David Bloor. Nobody denies this. It is interesting that basically after 1990, David Bloor was really no longer part of the conversation of STS. Voluntarily, he withdrew himself, partly as a result of the ascendancy of Latour. And I don't want to talk much about him. If you want to talk about him, we'll talk about him. I think he was a decent man. But there's a sense in which he was like, if you know this fable, the Pied Piper of Hamelin, right? The guy who plays the pipe and leads the rats in a certain direction, right? Latour was a bit like that. But a decent man. I debated him twice. Decent man, and really, I want to go further. He was someone who was very kind of influential, informative in the way I thought about things, but eventually as a kind of opponent. Okay, the problem is the followers, and with all of these things, the followers are the nightmare. Right? I mean, you just hate dealing with. I mean, it's like the fanboys and fangirls. Oh no, but the thing is that Bloor. So Bloor writes this book, Knowledge of Social Imagery, in 1976, 50 years this year. Before I came here, I have to say 15 minutes before I came here, I got an email from a colleague in Moscow who's trying to organize a special issue on the 50th anniversary of Knowledge and Social Imagery, Ilya Kasavin at the Royal Academy of Sciences. And he suddenly springs to me, Fuller, you wrote a review of the second edition of this book in the journal Philosophy of Science back in 1991, which is true. I hadn't remembered it. Certainly I hadn't remembered it for this talk. And indeed I did, right? Because this is an important work. He wanted access to it. I'll give him access to it. But the point is, yeah, I think this was a very important work, and the symmetry principle is the big deal. And I was first introduced to David Bloor's work through Mary Hesse at the University of Cambridge in the History and Philosophy of Science department. And for those who don't, let me just put her name up here. For those of you who may not know, quite an influential philosopher of science, I would say. I mean, not someone who was. She had problems. She was like the first woman to get a chair in philosophy, I think, maybe even at Cambridge. But certainly there was a lot of this kind of gender-based resistance to her. But some of you may know of her work. She writes about analogies in science. You don't know about her. She wrote a very interesting. I gotta say, she actually quite an interesting person. She wrote a book. Let me recommend it to you. Models and Analogies in Science, and that came out in 1963, I believe. I recommend this book because one of the things that she's saying, which I think is very relevant to now, given the way in which computer simulations are acting as models for reality, right? In very often very concrete ways, in the sense that we go from the models directly to the reality without even any empirical testing. Because back in the old days, back in those, scientific revolution days, people would have models, mental models, or they would have, mechanical models, and then they figure we have to go to a laboratory to test stuff. But nowadays, with the computer models, you can bypass all that stuff and just go directly to application, unless somebody starts talking to you about clinical trials and things like this, right? So in other words, the whole business about going from model to reality, which is what she was talking about in this book, and part of the reason why she wrote this book, by the way, was because it was a kind of response to the kind of logical positivist view, you might say, that talked about science as anti-imagination, right? Anti-literary, anti-art, you know what I mean, right? Where you get this very strong kind of, I think to a certain extent it was stereotyped, but you could kind of feel it, right? Anti-poetry, this kind of thing. And Mary Hesse was basically saying, no, if you look at these scientific revolution guys, etc., the models, the imagination play a very substantive role, in bringing about stuff. And so she was quite interested in knowledge and social imagery, and she was largely interested, because of the social imagery side. Okay, the extent to which certain kinds of images of how the world works, and she was someone who was influenced by Mary Douglas, who is someone who influenced Bloor as well. And Mary Douglas, you may know, is this anthropologist who for many years was at the University College London, right, and had these kind of images, you know, cosmological images of the world, which then got translated in the late 80s, early 90s into theories of risk, right, which became very, very important in political science and even economic circles. You know, so this guy, you may know this guy Wildowski, who hooked up with her in that period and translated a lot of these. So the cosmological dimensions have to do, she talks about in terms of danger and purity, but it has to do basically with what you allow in and what you don't allow, right? It's an inclusion, exclusion kind of binary. And then there's a kind of concern about how do you stratify within what you include, right? And she called this group and grid, right? You maybe know about this, right? David Bloor this is David Bloor's, you know, he's on this. And she was very keen on all this, Mary Hesse. She was very keen on this and how this influenced the way in which scientific debates went and so forth, because in a sense, one of the ways in which you can understand Kuhn's notion of paradigm, right, is that when the paradigm is in practice, when it's in, you know, when it's in its normal science phase, then all of this grid stuff matters, right? In terms of, you know, who's more right or more wrong, because there's agreed standards on what's going on, right? But when there's a crisis and then a revolution in science, right, the grid stuff disappears, and then we're group mode, right? Where we're really kind of at the edge. We're trying to figure out, well, what is true, what is false, at a very basic kind of level, right? And so this is where there's actually opportunity for a lot of transit to take place, you might say, between things that were previously thought to be non-scientific now become scientific, right? So a lot of political or philosophical or whatever matters, right, start to enter into the frame in a way they wouldn't have been allowed to enter into during a period of normal science. And that's kind of, you know, so the group penetration, you might say, phase, right? Now, Bloor had this, right? So Bloor has this kind of mentality, and Hesse really liked it. Interestingly, she didn't pay much attention to the symmetry stuff, okay? Which I think is coming from a different place. And this is what I think, though, makes Bloor's book kind of interesting, is because Bloor, in a way, and remember, you have to kind of keep in mind the way in which the sociology of scientific knowledge people thought about what they were doing. And I think this also applied to STS, applied, you know, even to Latour and all these people who, in a sense, move it very far away from the sociology of scientific knowledge, and that they were doing a science of science. Right. So it's not that, you know, science is another form of mythology or an elaborated version of primitive myths, you know, which in a sense is kind of how you might want to read Douglas, right? But it's different. It's about a science of science. And so then the question becomes, okay, what is science about? What is the nature of the scientific method? And so this issue of trying to capture sociologically a sense of neutrality, right? A sense of objectivity, you might say, right? Right? A sense of distance from the phenomena, right? And if you remember with Latour's laboratory life, Latour and Woolgar's laboratory life, right? Latour made a big deal in the beginning of the book about being someone who didn't know anything about science. Right, I'm just an anthropologist, man, and I'm cleaning test tubes, and you know, I'm glad these guys got me here. You know, it's kind of the mode, right? And so there is this using alienation as a kind of epistemic strength. Right. So in other words, I'm not part of this practice, so I come in there from a detached point of view. Right? Now this kind of idea, now at the time, okay, and I may even mention this in the first book I wrote, Social Epistemology, because I have to say, as someone who comes from this kind of postmodern background and literary theory and blah, 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 I actually do come from that, that it reminded me so much of Victor Shklovsky. Does that name mean anyone to me anything? Oh, you don't know this man. Russian formalism. Come on, you guys, you losers. You guys should know this. Right? Because you're the guys who produced Roman Jakobson. Right? Roman Jakobson, the linguist, right? He's from here, right? Come on. Right? Russian formalism.
Talking about Shklovsky, I think 2 weeks ago.
Right?
But he's not here today. He was supposed to be here.
Art. I'd love to be there. Right. Art is device, right? Art is technique, right? I mean, and the point that he's making, right, which Latour is making in Laboratory Life, right, is this idea that art involves alienation, right? It involves a certain kind of self-alienation where in a sense, you have to frame the thing. You have to kind of come into it, not as already being part of it, but you have to create a certain distance to it. And then the art comes from how you create the distance, right? The art comes from how you create the distance. What is the right distance from which to see something? And if you do it right, and Laboratory Life was a success story in that regard, because it really, if I have to say, what is the most important book in science technology studies, it's that book, Laboratory Life. There's no doubt about it. That is the most important book. And it's because the way it presented, right, the scientific practice, right, created the right distance where it didn't totally denigrate it and did that kind of ideological demystification bullshit that Marxists were already doing, right? Because you know about the Marxists, right? The Marxist stuff was already there, right, when science technology studies came in, and they were talking about science as bourgeois ideology, blah, blah, right, and it was very coarse, it was very gross in a certain way, right? Very coarse-grained, and it never got actually into the practice in any kind of substantial way, and didn't, so it didn't really engage with the phenomena sufficiently, but it's not a matter of just simply representing the phenomena in its own terms. It's by discovering a certain kind of position you can adopt toward it, where you can make it even more illuminating than the people involved in it. That's art. That's art, right? And Latour, he figured that out. I don't recall, to be honest with you, it's been a long time since I've actually looked at the book, but I don't recall whether Shklovsky is cited in the book. Latour is a very learned man. I wouldn't put it past him. But that's where it's coming from, right? It's this way, because so much of the 20th century ethnographic blah blah tradition, right, is about being able to capture what's going on and so forth. And the question becomes, okay, you can describe all kinds of stuff and people come in with different angles and so forth, but what's a good angle? What's a good angle? And a good angle, independently of whatever imperial nonsense you bring to the situation, right? What's a good angle, right? Is there some kind of independent way of doing it? It's kind of an aesthetic question, right? And I think Latour captured that, and at least that's the way and I thought that was kind of the thing, you might say, about science and technology studies at its best, was that it could capture the angle, right, to present this kind of situation as art, right, where it's something different from what you expected. It's different from something that you would have experienced. And it's different also from something that legitimizes it. It's a different thing, right? And I thought that was, and so this is where the symmetry principle starts to animate me, because the symmetry principle, in a way, might be a way of somehow capturing what's involved here? What's going on? What's exactly happening when you are able to see the whole scientific situation in this way? Okay. Um, and um, and so this has led to my now in terms of my own involvement, right? I should say something. So I first get involved in science technology studies while I'm writing my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh. My PhD is on this topic: bounded rationality in law and science. Okay? And so what it's about the conditions of decision making under constraints. Okay? And what I'm imagining in the PhD is that the scientist, let's say, examining a laboratory result, right, or some observation in the field, is very much like a judge in a court case where you have arguments being presented and you have to decide, right? And the point about bounded rationality, which is a term from Herbert Simon, who was a very influential, Herbert Simon, so I was at the University of Pittsburgh. Herbert Simon was across the street at Carnegie Mellon University, right? He was a big professor there, and this was during the period that he was sort of transitioning from being this big guy in the political science of administrative behavior to being this artificial intelligence guy. It was there and so Carnegie Mellon developed this kind of very innovative sort of faculty of decision sciences. Decision sciences, right? And decision sciences cuts across, right? Politics and artificial intelligence, if you're talking about what machines can do, right? And of course, if you think about the Turing test, and that's also in the back of my mind, and it should be back in your minds now, right? The Turing test is a decision test, right? It's about deciding who is a human and who is not a human, right? That this is the kind of mentality we're talking about here, right? About decisions. And so then decisions, right, are based on evidence being presented. And, there's a certain point at which, so there are two things. You want sufficient evidence on both sides, you might say, if there's a kind of disagreement. If there wasn't a disagreement, there wouldn't be a need for a decision. That goes to the root of the word decision, right? It has to be a disagreement, then you have to make a decision about it. And then, of course, you have to do it within a finite amount of time and space, where you just can't forever be gathering evidence and all that blah, blah stuff, right? Right, you have to kind of make a decision. And so I saw the symmetry principle as kind of in that orbit of thinking, okay? Now, that wasn't something that was in Latour and Bloor never talked really about this very much. And Latour, Bloor, I should say one thing about Bloor, just as a point, in case there are people here interested in Bloor. One of the things that I always found sort of puzzling about Bloor, so when I did my master's degree under Mary Hess at Cambridge before I went to Pittsburgh. And when I was at Cambridge, aside from Mary Hess, the one person who I spent a lot of time thinking about and reading and who was discussed very widely in the lectures back then was Michael Dummett. Do any of you remember this guy? Michael Dummett? I know this is interesting. You people don't, yeah. He was a big deal. Okay? Truth and Other Enigmas. Okay? Big deal analytic philosopher. Now the thing about, he's the guy who coined the word anti-realism. Okay, you may know about that word, okay? He coined it. And he was a guy who came from the philosophy of mathematics, right? Actually came from mathematics, and he was kind of known primarily as a Frege scholar. Okay, Gottlob Frege, you know him. Okay, he's a Frege scholar and wrote the most important, I think, interesting book about Frege's philosophical framework in English. And his thing was that so there is this lively discussion that's taking place already in the 1970s about realism and about the and that's because logical positivism, if you recall logical positivism wasn't normally understood as a realist philosophy. Right, logical positivism, because of verificationism, right? You can't say something is true unless you can verify that it's true, right? That basic fundamental principle, right? The fact that the logical positivists always wanted to be able to construct the world from micro bits, whether these were observations or parts of the material world, right, right. But there was a sense in which logical positivism seemed to be very open-minded about whether there's an ultimate reality. And certainly because it was very anti-theological, right, right? If you think about the kinds of things where logical positivism figured politically, tend to be atheistic, right? Certainly A.J. Ayer, I guess A.J. Ayer would be the one who was most like that. Right, right. There's a sense in which there loomed philosophically this problem of whether logical positivism was committed to realism. I don't think it was, right? I mean, and Dummett, to his credit, knew this and agreed with it, but he said we need to be metaphysical about it, okay? Because as you know, the logical positivists were very much anti-metaphysical, because they thought that metaphysics always created false realities, right? God, or the state, or the spirit, or life. You think about the things the logical positivists were against, right? They were against reification of concepts, which could then stand as these overarching realities that then regulate whatever you can think, right? Logical positivism was definitely against that, right? And Dummett was too, but Dummett believed that you still needed a kind of metaphysical basis for it. You know, it wasn't, as it were, to be, so in other words, to be anti-realism isn't to be anti-metaphysics. You need a metaphysics of anti-realism, okay? That's Dummett, okay? And I won't go into all the details of how he cashed this out. I think it was to this day, I think it's very interesting, and I go back to it from time to time, because he dealt with various issues in philosophy in these terms, the problem of time, right, quantum mechanics. He's got lots to say about all kinds of things in this regard. Arguments for retrocausality, So in other words, he's an anti-realist who takes the metaphysics seriously. Now, my point in all this is not to go down, talking about Dummett, but to say Bloor never clued into this. Bloor should have clued into this, because this was a kindred spirit, okay? So in other words, if you wanted, now I know, of course, that within sociology, there is this thing, right, called social constructivism. You all know about this, right? Which is an anti-realist view. It's an anti-realist view, and it's a very, it's a specification, you might say, of the anti-realist view, right? Because basically it says, as Dummett himself said, that the nature of something is not something that is already there waiting to be discovered, but is something that is accomplished or achieved, right? So it operates with a kind of open-ended understanding of the future, whereas maybe the past is closed, but then one can argue about this too. But the point is, generally speaking, right, it's a kind of a view about the asymmetry of time, functioning, and knowledge, right? Where there's a sense in which there's no reason to think that somehow the fact that something's happened the same in the past will happen in the future, right? So it's anti-inductivist. And by the way, this is one reason why Bloor, and I think a lot of these anti-realists, often saw Popper as kind of an interesting person, because Popper is definitely anti-inductivist, right? Anti-inductivist, right? And so he shares that with the social constructivists. And that is one of the way, and so you see in some of Bloor's writing, there's a kind of a association there. But the point is that social constructivism can often be, well, first of all, kind of a one-trick pony in a way, because it is just simply about the openness of the situation in which decisions need to be made, right? And especially if you have this kind of late Wittgensteinian, highly reduced version of anti-realism. Whereas Dummett has a much more sophisticated. Now, to be true, Dummett read Wittgenstein. Dummett knows the late Wittgenstein, right? So Dummett has, as it were, the benefit of having read Wittgenstein to be more sophisticated than Wittgenstein. So I'm not blaming Wittgenstein for this one. But I think somebody like Bloor, I'm a little surprised, given that Bloor was himself at Cambridge. I mean, I'm a little surprised that he never clued into Dummett. But I would say, if you want to pursue anti-realism, in a serious fashion, this is the man you would look at, right? This is the man you would look at. But in any case, the thing about the symmetry principle is, the symmetry principle sort of presumes that there is a decision point. So you have to be kind of a bit constructivist. You have to be a bit open-minded about the future. Otherwise, the whole business of making a judgment about things, because the symmetry principle is about the principle on which you make a judgment about what you see. That doesn't matter if you believe reality is already settled, right? Symmetry is a principle of method for the observer. So the observer has to matter for the symmetry principle even to make sense. You don't need a symmetry principle for an independent reality. You need a symmetry principle for the observer, okay? And it seems to me that this has epistemic force if you are someone who believes that in some sense the reality is open in the future, right? That in some sense it could go a variety of ways. I'm not saying it could go any old way, but the point is it's not predetermined. It's not predetermined.
And isn't this asymmetry in the sense that
it's asymmetry from the standpoint of time,
yeah.
But it's symmetry from the standpoint of the observer at the moment, right? There's a difference. There's a difference between the asymmetry of time and the symmetry of the observer in the moment. That's a good point, right? Because you got to get clear about this, right? And this is why, if you think about what I'm talking about here geometrically, in some of my more recent writing, I talk about orthogonality, right? Orthogonality, the right angle. Okay, so imagine that time is asymmetrical, goes from the past to the future. It's like this, right? It goes like this. But you're in the moment, right? You're in the moment. You're at right angles, right? You're orthogonal to the flow, and you have to make a decision. Right? That's orthogonality.
That's like Newtonian orthogonality.
Yeah.
Because like in four-dimensional space-time, you are also orthogonal, space is orthogonal to time, but basically only at your point, and you define what is future and
that's right.
What is past.
Yes.
Relatively. So the orthogonality is important, but it's not absolute. It's not like
no, it's not absolute. It's not absolute. No. But this is the point, right? This is where, if you want to do the metaphysics behind the symmetry principle, this is kind of where you go, I think, right? Where you accept the asymmetricality of time, but the symmetricality of the choice that the observer has to make at a given point. And that observer is, could be the ethnographer, could be anyone, whatever, right? I mean, and I think if we start from that perspective, then we begin to kind of get a sense of the deep aspect of this, right? The thing that needs to survive beyond whatever happens to SSK or STS or Bloor or whatever, right? I mean, it seems to me that this is a deep point, okay? And then the question is, okay, what do you do with this? And this is where I want to talk a bit about epistemic justice, okay? And here I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Now, some of you may know, so we're going to move away now from all this STS style stuff, and talk about this person a little bit, just a little bit. Miranda Fricker. You ever heard of this woman? Anyone know about her? Nobody knows about her. Oh my goodness. You didn't know about Dummett, you don't know about her.
We don't treat we right.
Okay. She's actually kind of a big deal, okay? Not as big as Dummett, not as big as Dummett, but she's kind of a big deal. So in 2007, she wrote, so what is she now? She's now a professor of philosophy at, I think, New York University or something like that. She's British, and I think Cambridge PhD, studied with Bernard Williams, a second edition of, this book Bernard Williams wrote on truth. I don't know if you guys, if you know Bernard Williams is. Bernard Williams, the Cambridge philosopher, died a few years ago. Okay, well, in any case, okay. Well, the thing is that she wrote this book in 2007 called Epistemic Injustice. Cambridge University, no, Oxford University. This book is the book that people normally cite when they talk about epistemic justice. Though if you notice, the title is Epistemic Injustice. And her premise is that we already know that, again, those of you who are, if any of you are in analytic philosophy, one of the things that you know about this field, which is in a way often very empowering, but also frustrating and infuriating even, is that it relies very heavily on intuitions, so-called intuitions. You know what I'm talking about? Intuitions, right? Right. So in other words, if you want to come up with a theory of what's good and bad and so forth, you start by basically surveying your reaction to things. right. In a way, it's kind of a holdover from logical positivism, perhaps. I mean, so in other words, what's good and bad? Well, let's look at a situation. Is this good or bad? Right? And you say yes or no. Right? And then you construct a theory on the back of these judgments that you make, right? These intuitions that you have, right? And you have these intuitions before you've articulated any kind of theory of judgment, right? You just have these intuitions and they're spontaneous, or I don't know what you want to call them, right? But they're your natural intuitions. So Fricker starts with the assumption that we have natural intuitions about injustice, right? Right. And in a sense, we don't need, she actually says this, we don't need a theory of justice, right? Because our intuitions about what's unjust are so strong and so vivid, right? That in a sense, we can move from there. We don't need a theory, right? So there's no, it's not, so if you read Miranda Fricker's Epistemic Injustice, what you will not find is a theory of justice. You won't find even an endorsement of the existing theories of justice, Rawls, Nozick, the virtue theory people, right? She doesn't actually, she's kind of a virtue theory person, which is typical of people who rely on intuitions a lot. But there's no theory of justice, either original or borrowed, right? There's no theory of justice. But the point is, she can talk about the as it were paradigm cases, right? This is something very much part of the armament of analytic philosophy, right? We have paradigm cases, right, of injustice, where we can all agree X is an injustice.
Like the approach that's I think like Sperber they wrote this book, The Enigma of Reason or something like that.
Yeah.
They would argue that this is the only honest position because everybody
I know, but
else
you're absolutely right. In fact, I was in a panel with Sperber last year at the How the Light Gets In festival in Britain. I don't know if you know about this. Largest philosophy festival in the world, takes place in May, end of May, this year as well, called How the Light Gets In Festival. I was on a panel with the great Dan Sperber, who I have a lot of respect for. I have to say I have a lot of respect for him. But he's kind of a wannabe analytic philosopher. Right? He's an anthropologist, for those of you who don't know, he's an anthropologist.
and cognitive scientists.
Yeah, and cognitive scientist, yes. Yes, but he's by training an anthropologist and trained under Levi-Strauss, and he's an old guy, right? And so over the years, he's kind of morphed into being a cognitive scientist, right? But he's an anthropologist. And so he's a guy who buys into this way of operating. And I'm not saying, by the way, his theory of reason is wrong. But it's not right because of the intuitions. Let's put it that way.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. So I don't see. So the thing is, we've got these people who are pushing in intuitions as being the basis, right, for a conception of epistemic justice through injustice, right? So if we can all agree on what counts as unjust, we then know in some sense what's justice. And the problem is that, and if you look at Fricker's book, and people really love this stuff, right? Because she caters. I don't want to say cater. Catering is too nasty a word, but she's very much on the vibe of our time about injustice. She's tuned in, right? And so all the things that all of us right-minded people would think are unjust, and so. But she doesn't, so there's no theory of justice on the back of it, properly speaking. But there is something, though, and that's kind of a diagnosis of injustice, which passes as a theory, okay? You think about how you make theories, right? There are some people in this world who make theories as a kind of a diagnostic of something that's wrong, but don't really give you any kind of positive framework, but can diagnose. And so she talks a lot about, let's put it this way. Her paradigm cases of injustice are the ones that you can readily imagine where you have a dominant party failing to listen to a subordinate party, right? That's the kind of thing, right? Because the subordinate party is not taken seriously, because of their gender, their race, their class, their knowledge, whatever, and the dominant party just writes them off. They don't count. They're not looked at. Okay, that's basically the paradigm case of injustice. I don't think we can. I wouldn't deny this, right? This is definitely there. But then the way she go about doing her diagnostics is to say that the problem is a problem of exclusive problem of the dominant party. Okay, and so it's the issue, if you want to talk about a hearer-speaker relation, right, is that the hearer doesn't hear everything the speaker is saying, right? So the hearer is the dominant party, the speaker is the recessive, the subordinate party. And so all of the critique, all of the normativity falls back on the hearer, right? And so we then get a kind of big classification of all the kinds of injustices that person is committing to the speaker. Hermeneutical injustice, testimonial injustice, right? Depending on the nature of the speech of the speaker, right? And that's kind of where it ends. I mean, it's a book, and people get a lot out of it, but that's pretty much the theory, right? And there's no real discussion, for example, of structural issues involved. There's no real discussion, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it's presumed that there's a dominance relation going on. That's presumed, but there's no sense of that the speaker needs to do something themselves, right? So this is not a formula for revolution or anything like that on the part of the supported parties, by no means, right? It's really a kind of a critique of the hearer, a critique of the dominant party. And that is really popular, right? Because the people who are writing about this stuff are themselves guilty dominant party people, regardless of their race, gender, whatever, right? But what's left behind is the idea of a theory of justice. Okay, right. There is no theory of epistemic justice. There's this other thing going on, that's kind of a simulacrum, right, of a theory of justice, which I think is about guilt tripping and about people exonerating themselves for their sins, and but there's no standard of justice that's actually being invoked, right? Because it's all packed into the intuitions, which are themselves never unpacked. Okay? Right? So this is not Marxism, which would have a kind of structural thing going on. No, this is analytic philosophy. Okay? And this is actually the most widely regarded theory of what gets close to epistemic justice that we've got, is that. Okay? And so this is why I want to bring in the symmetry principle. Because I think, in a sense, we need a theory of justice. And we have to think about, and if we're going to think about a theory of justice, the first thing we need to do is not to focus on the intuitively unjust cases, which of course they're important. I'm not dismissing them, but that's not the first thing to go for. The first thing to go for is the standpoint from which justice can be delivered. Okay? And one of the things that I would say about Rawls and Nozick, both of them, from the 1970s, is that those guys answered that question, right? They had answers.
I would say that Rawls formalized intuitions quite well.
Yeah. I'm going to get to my critique of Rawls, but yeah. Rawls is not perfect, right? But there's a sense in which
he gets close, right?
Right. But just wait, just be patient, man. We're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. Don't worry. I know where you're going. We're gonna get there. But the point is, look, what you need to do is to get a sense of sort of if you want to make decisions about justice, you have to think about what is the standpoint of the decision maker. What is the standpoint? And I think that both Rawls and Nozick, in their different ways, would agree that the standpoint of the decision maker has to be detached in some way. It has to be, and then the question of the detachment. So we go back to what I was saying about Latour and the alienation and Shklovsky and all that jazz, right? Right. This mentality, bring this mentality into the frame, okay? Where you want to fit, and so then the question becomes, what is the frame? Now, when I wrote my PhD on bounded rationality, one of the things that I was playing with in the PhD was the idea that one might think about bounded rationality as a kind of voluntary way of amplifying and suppressing different kinds of information that one might already have. Right? If one wants to make a fair judgment, there's a sense in which the information that we already have available to us might actually not be fair in itself. And so what you need to do then is to engage in some kind of calibration exercise where some of the information becomes more important and some of the information becomes less important. Okay, this is where Rawls is really smart, right? Because Rawls gets this, I think. Rawls gets this with the original position, right? And you may know about it as the veil of ignorance. Okay, and so this is, so if you want to, and he's talking about the constitution of the just society. So he's talking about justice at the most fundamental level, you might say, right? We're not talking about the justice of how do you decide particular cases, though it may have application there, and certainly the legal people have taken it that way. but it's in terms of how you constitute this society, and you want to be fair to everyone who is likely to be part of that society, right? That's kind of the frame. And so he says that what you need to know is basically what we might say history and social science. So you need to know the general things about the human condition. You need to know about the general tendencies, both the good and the bad, whatever, right? I mean, you need to know that stuff. You need to understand how human beings operate. You need to know that. What you don't need to know, and this is the suppressed part, is who you are in this arrangement, right? Whether you are a person of a certain race, whether you are a person of a certain class, right? This is what you don't know. You don't know who specifically you are. And so you have to decide a regime knowing all this, but not knowing the specificity of your identity. And Rawls said, this is justice, okay? Now, Rawls reasons this in a particular way, which is what you're alluding to. He has a particular way of cashing this out as a practice, right? Which ends up giving you a kind of welfare state, where where people will tend to decide under those conditions to make sure that however low they are in the society, they're not too low, right? It's a kind of a, so it's a risk minimization approach. This is what Rawls says people would take, and so that would favor a relatively large welfare net, okay? And he has other things that makes it sound more liberal than what I'm saying here, because he's saying stuff like the way wealth should be distributed should only be in terms of that the worse off benefit more than the better off would lose, right? So he has all that kind of operating in his equation too. But generally speaking, it's a kind of risk minimization approach, right? Where people were in this position of not knowing their identities, but knowing all the conditions, the human condition, right? They would tend to be rather precautionary, let's put it that way, in the contemporary terms, right? Now, Rawls was criticized for this when he put forward his book. In fact, the best criticism, for those of you who are interested, R.M. Hare. Are you familiar with this man, R.M. Hare? Does that name mean anything to you? He is the man who invented metaethics, right? Brilliant metaethics. He was the PhD supervisor of Peter Singer at Oxford. And metaethics is very relevant to animal rights, because metaethics takes a second order position where you're not committing to the substance, as it were, of the beings who are governed under the laws, but rather the principles, regardless of what the substance is, right? So if we're going to be a utilitarian, we're not just a utilitarian about humans, we're a utilitarian about animals, because they're sentient just like the humans are, and the utilitarians measure value in terms of feeling. Right? So this is metaethics, gets you into that space. And R.M. Hare basically said in response to Rawls that Rawls was too conservative. That in fact, if people were put in this position, they would decide more radically. They take a chance, right? Because the whole idea of not knowing who you are doesn't need to be seen as a source of fear, but rather could be seen as, okay, I know all this stuff, and I also know that the human condition overall is moving along, overall, generally speaking, progressive. So why not take a risk? In other words, minimize the welfare net.
I'm not sure if you are getting to the difference, but when we are talking about like Rawls ethics and epistemic justice, I would bring up the very big difference between like rival wealth and non-rival wealth, right? Because in epistemic justice, you can basically build a knowledge net that doesn't like deprecate if people know the same things that you do, right?
Right. No, this is true. This is a good point, actually. Yeah. Good. It's a good point. But I don't think Rawls would not be against this.
Of course not. But when he speaks about welfare state and legitimization of inequalities and stuff like that, most often people just think about the rival part of wealth. Like
I know, I understand. Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
because that would have implications for the distribution of knowledge in society and like the just distribution.
No, you're right. And you're raising a very important issue about the way in which, yeah, well, we could have a whole, that's another lecture, man. I mean,
Okay.
okay, I'm just gonna, I could send it to you by email, but one of the big problems that we have with the nature of knowledge as a good is the problem of rentiership, right? Which creates this kind of exclusion stuff you're talking about, right? Where knowledge is considered as property.
Yeah, you cannot tax knowledge, basically.
Well, so you say, right? But as long as intellectual property law exists, people are gonna try damn hard. Right. So the point is, we do have this problem. You can email me and I'll send it to you. I wrote a book, 2002 actually, called Knowledge Management Foundations, which focused on this issue. Because this was during the period where the internet had just come on stream, and there was a lot of discussion in the late 1990s about the proprietarial character of knowledge that was going to arise as a result of the internet, where it was imagined back in the late 90s that all the knowledge that is now in books and so forth would end up being, as it has been, digitized, right? And that digitalization would then make it easier to convert it into property. And we do see this, right? I mean, so that did happen. In fact, the Chinese are interviewing me about, there's a translation of this book that's in progress in Chinese, because the Chinese say, Paul, you were on top of this. No, so this is an issue, right? I don't want to talk about it any more than this, but the point is, if you want to find out about it, just contact me. I'll send you this book. 2002, very early days, but nevertheless, this issue was being discussed. In fact, there's this term, this character, Yanis Varoufakis?
Yeah.
This guy? Okay. And he talks about information feudalism. Okay. You may know about this. This is one of his big deals, right? Let me just see. Sorry. Information feudalism, right? Which is the idea that different companies will, in a sense, knowledge will be carved up like domains in a very literal way, where there'll be property rights across the different domains, right? Information feudalism. Well, this was an idea that was already there in 1995. Okay, I talk about this in the Knowledge Management Foundation book, but Varoufakis, the fact that he's talking about it means it's real, right? It means it's an important thing. But this is, so we're talking like what, 25, 30 years now? This has been brewing, right? This issue has been brewing in a big way. Because of course, historically, people have thought about knowledge very much like Adam Smith thought about air and water and stuff like that, right? That there was non-rivalrous, that everyone could have access to it without others being deprived of it, right? But this is not the case, okay? This is not the case. It's not just information feudalism, by the way. I do think that this kind of rentiership thing already had begun with another issue that, credentialism, right? As soon as you were no longer required, as long as you couldn't actually offer opinions or judgments without having a degree in a certain subject, and that degree usually involves some effort on your part, if not actual money on your part, you didn't have a voice, right? That's part of the rentiership too. That predates the internet. Credentialism, right? The way we kind of, and this, we start marching our way back to where Miranda Fricker and the epistemic injustice comes from, right? Where you're not listening to certain people because you figure these people don't have the right degrees, these people don't have the right background, blah, 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 right. So you could see where that the intuitions behind the epistemic injustice of the Miranda-Fricker sort are closely connected to this kind of rentiership problem, right? So this is not to, so again, not to dismiss Miranda-Fricker, but it is not enough as a theory of epistemic justice, right? That one needs an actual positive theory, right? And this is where Rawls, Rawls in a way is kind of in the right ballpark in the sense that whenever we do make judgments about knowledge, right? I mean, one way to look at this now, okay? So, back when I was writing the PhD, I was thinking in terms of certain forms of knowledge being amplified and other forms being diminished. But there are other issues, other ways of looking at this, more contemporary, you might say, that kind of gets you in the right mindset, right? So, for example, one thing that has become very prominent, especially in light of this guy Kahneman, right? Kurt Tversky and Kahneman, confirmation bias, right? The extent to which so much of the knowledge that we have about what's going on in the world and what we make of other people comes from the fact that we have been exposed to certain things in the past, right? So in a sense, induction itself, right? The inductive evidence that we have from our own experiences are themselves a confirmation bias, right? Because they tend to reinforce certain kinds of ways we've been seeing the world, right? And so that is one of the things that, in a sense, you want to remove from the original position. You want to remove the confirmation bias that you might have when you approach a situation, okay? And in fact, we can even get a little more contemporary about this, because some of you know about this character, Bostrom. Okay, right, so there's the, what's he call it? The observer-selector effect. Do you know about this? This is
Or like an observer selection effect?
Yeah, whatever, but it's the same thing. Right, same deal. Namely, because we're in a certain place in the universe.
Metaverse.
Yeah, we see things a certain way. And we think, for example, this is an argument against the so-called anthropic principle, right, in cosmology. Right, the anthropic principle says the way that the universe's constants are the way they are, and the laws are the way they are, is a sort of design, so that we can observe them. Right?
But that's just strong anthropic principle. I would say like observer selection effect is like very much in line with anthropic principle because
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's the point. Yes. And he was saying this as a critique, right? Right. And there's a sense in which we potentially have this problem when we're trying to deal with matters of justice, because we have a kind of observer selector effect based on our own experience, based on the way our experience is kind of configured the way we see the world, and we're not able to, really see things from an independent standpoint, right? We're less independent than we think we are, okay? And this is, and the symmetry principle is a kind of aspiration, you might say, to this kind of independence, right? And I would say that Rawls's original position is kind of an interesting way of getting into the issue, right? And the problems with Rawls's own way of dealing with this is interesting too, right? As a kind of instructive exercise. Now Nozick, and I just want to say something about Nozick as a kind of counterforce, because when Nozick wrote this book, Robert Nozick, right? Anarchy, State, Utopia, 1974. You know about this book? Yeah, okay. Okay, so he takes a different line, but it's a line that is familiar in our times as well. Especially for the people who are keen on reparations. Right? You know about this reparation stuff? I don't know what you guys think of it.
we like them because we have quite recent experience with like restitutions after the communist era.
Yeah.
And it's something similar. It was just 40 years, but it made a lot of sense, right?
Do you know John Elster's work on transitional justice?
No.
Okay.
It sounds interesting. I just
Just as a side note, John Elster, the Norwegian philosopher, who's now at Columbia University, right, has this stuff on transitional justice, which includes former Soviet Union, blah blah blah, kind of stuff. But the reparations issue, right? Where does the sense of justice from reparations come from? Well, Nozick actually gives you the answer to that question, okay? Because Nozick says that if you want to talk about justice, and we imagine a kind of situation where you might say, in the beginning, we are free individuals contracting with each other, then the injustice comes from the terms of the contract, right? Where there's been some injustice in the way the contract was formulated, right? Where somebody was lied to, right? Where someone was in a sense forced to agree to something they shouldn't have agreed to, right? That's where Nozick is coming from, right? And it's true that if you look at somebody like John Locke, that is his notion of the social contract, right? It's this idea of free individuals, gathering together and deciding non-coercively to get into this situation. This is where John Locke's social contract is different from Hobbes, right? For Hobbes, right, people are in a state of desperation and fear, right? And then they're driven into the social contract. But for John Locke, we start off in a case where people are kind of free and cool and they decide amongst themselves, but then perhaps over the course of history, people get coerced, people take advantage of each other, right? And if you can trace that, if you can find where those are the injustices, right? The injustices are, as it were, in the transmission of the contractual arrangements, starting from a state of freedom, right? And there's where reparations come from. The whole reparationist mentality comes from that, right? If you believe that, right? Because then you can say, well, look, we thought that this was happening and it wasn't really happening, and it was completely, we were fooled and we shouldn't have been fooled. We were, then you can start making reparations. And so from Nozick's standpoint, right, justice, right, is just about that, right? Justice is not about, if you want to talk about problems of justice, you talk about problems in the past. You don't talk about going forward, right? And that was a big kind of point of argument in the 1970s and 80s, I would say. Not so much after that, maybe. But the legacy of that way of thinking, that kind of alternative way of thinking about justice, right, is still very much with us. Not, maybe not so much with the libertarians who, in a sense, Nozick was seen as championing at the time, but more the kind of politically correct people, right? The people who are calling for reparations, right? Those people, they're the heirs of Nozick, right? They're the heirs of Nozick. And those are the people who you'll see completely dismiss Rawls, right? They don't want to have anything to do with the guy. And that's kind of interesting, right? That's kind of interesting. And I think if we're going to be talking about a sense of epistemic justice in a serious way, as involving a positive theory of justice, then in a sense, going back to this kind of debate between Rawls and Nozick is actually very helpful. Okay? And obviously, in my personal view, and this is one reason why Rawls is picked up much more by the legal community than Nozick is that this idea of justice as involving a certain amount of blindness, right? Where in certain sense you sort of do not look at certain things. You may emphasize certain things, but you don't look at certain things. And you know how to draw the distinction between the two. That this has always been kind of a hallmark of justice, because you take seriously the fact that you as a human observer are always in a kind of prejudicial position, right? You're always sort of biased one way or another. There's always this kind of observer-selector effect. There's always this confirmation bias. There's always this stuff going on. So part of the principles of justice have to involve a kind of calibration of what should be allowed to enter into the record and what should not be allowed into the record. And this is preferable, I would say, to the Nozick thing, because the Nozick thing, if you take it seriously, relies on historical accuracy. And you're never going to win that one. Nobody's going to win that one, right? So any reparations that are granted on the basis of history is going to be overturned on all kinds of grounds. And one of the ways you can see this, by the way, and I'll end on this point. I don't know if this person, do you know this person? Maybe some of you know this person. Have you heard of this person, Alondra Nelson? Okay, she was the science and technology policy advisor for Joe Biden. Okay, and she's a professor, I think maybe at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton. Right, you know who she is, right? Okay, so she wrote a very interesting book about the use of DNA testing. You know, these former slave things in the United States, right? Right, and so, you know, who exactly is entitled to reparations, blah, blah, right? And of course, one could do sort of genealogies, right? But of course, with DNA, hey, science, hey, clear evidence, hey, you know, so let's deploy this DNA. It just creates more chaos, more confusion because of where the DNA comes from. Okay, it makes it more difficult. This is kind of the punchline of her book, right? Right, that you have all these people who have all these stories to tell and everything, and then they say they want to be bolstered by science, right? And the science just throws it up into dust. Okay, and to be honest with you, no matter what your favorite science is, this is going to happen if you go the reparations route. You're not going to get justice by going back to the past. I think that's kind of the bottom line. Don't even go there, right? Justice is going to be much more likely to be a future forward thing where you're systematically apportioning knowledge and ignorance. And this is where Rawls, I think, can give you a certain kind of purchase on this as a starting point, not as the end point, not as conclusions, but the methodology. The methodology is something that we can at least start from and think of this as a kind of application of the symmetry principle, you know, at the level of justice.
Can I ask?
I'll stop here. I'll formally stop here so then we can have the questions. Okay? Wait, I want to stop so I don't speak anymore. I'll speak in response to your question.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to ask, you know, what is the symmetry? Because somehow I had the feeling from your talk that what you mean by symmetry is freedom, actually.
It's freedom for the observer.
Yeah, and for me, somehow symmetry is very strong restriction.
No,
Because this is, you know, somehow when you speak about symmetry, it is already, you know, somehow before you start even think about the thing, it has to have the symmetry, which is very strong restrictions.
well, it does in the sense
I'm surprised how you are using the word.
Well, because
freedom. So
because it involves decision, right? And observation is a decision. And so then you have to think about what are the two things that I'm deciding between, right? You have to imagine that kind of, that's where the symmetry comes from. There are two things. And then you have to think, and so the restriction you're talking about comes from how do we put these in balance? How do we put these in balance that we can decide between them? It's like, you know, the blindfolded justice, right? I mean, Rawls, in a sense, is really responding to that. And I think that's the way to look at symmetry. So, yes, there is restriction, but it's a restriction in terms of trying to get the two sides in a way that you can judge between them.
in your word, symmetry is opposite to that. It is freedom. It is really
Freedom is the observer. No, the freedom is the observer because what the observer decides will happen. Think about, it's like quantum mechanics, right? I mean, it's like that. It's more like that, right? Where in a sense, it's not predetermined what the outcome's going to be.
Yeah. The symmetry in this sense is that when your decision is going to be 50-50, that's the symmetry. But there is another book by Kahneman and some other colleagues than Tversky, The Noise, right? And his point is that when the judge is deciding before lunch, he's going to issue more harsh sentences.
Yeah, but
and this is the kind of asymmetry that you don't want to have
Exactly.
in your system.
Exactly,
So
exactly. That's what you have to
Yeah.
control for those biases. But the point is, yeah, what you're trying to do is you have to start off by trying to get a balanced position on what's going on in the situation, right? And there could be an imbalance. Well, for example, because of power imbalance is coming into the thing, right? One, in a court case, one side might have much better lawyers than the other,
But
right? I mean, all kinds of
but
reasons why there can
it's
be
not-
imbalance to begin with.
it's not the kind of strong symmetry because you don't want the decision of the judge being 50-50. You just want them to have the same, it's the exchangeability, not necessarily
Exactly,
symmetry, right?
exactly,
There is
exactly.
no specific or privileged position
That's right.
between these points, so it's just like really.
That's right. Yeah,
You are saying that we have to decide between the two issues, right? In fact, very often we encounter more than two.
oh, I know.
And so this goes much deeper because you have basically tendencies to think in like Unitarian concepts. You have also bipolar theories, but you have also theories based on three principles
Sure.
and maybe even more.
Sure.
And so we are getting to the question of diversity, pluralism, and all these things. So I would question your premise that we are always deciding between the two.
Well, look, decision is about making a cut, okay? And then, and so this goes back to the Stoics. These are the guys who really kind of, on the back of Plato, kind of really put this idea of decision as being a very significant moral activity. And they were thinking about drawing distinction between the two. And so yeah, you do have to draw, you do have to make decisions among more than just two things, sure. But the setup remains the same, it seems to me. It's just more complicated, but it's basically the same position. I mean, I'm not sure why the plurality makes this less plausible.
No, the thing is that when you start getting this rock, paper, scissors dynamics, you cannot just reduce sorting of options into binary decisions. So
Sure.
but that's like that's the only alternative dynamics, because otherwise, if you have like stable ranking of options, you can always like picture this as a series of binary decisions,
Yes.
like all sorting algorithms.
Yeah. No, we're not talking about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But if you get rock, paper, scissors dynamics or equivalence, then it cannot be reducible.
Yes. Yes, John.
Yeah, there's a interesting epistemic issue here, because what we've been discussing is the Edinburgh Strong program, presented as a science of science. That's the symmetry position. Science has to be studied by science, and that means no assumption of the truth or otherwise of the discourse there. So then the science is sociology. The only thing we haven't heard of in this session is anything about sociology.
You're right.
Sociology has been removed. So there's no discussion of the symmetry position within what the symmetry assumptions of sociology are. Now, go into aspect of what they are, and that partly, and we discussed this before, I was in the Edinburgh department, was alongside the Strong program, so familiar with in my view, it was a philosophical position, the Strong program, and the sociology followed on from it, but it's come back here as a philosophical position rather than the sociology that follows on from it. So
That's right.
Symmetry position within, there's a symmetry position within sociology, and there's a epistemic justice injustice position within social constructionism. So I'd say within social constructionism, the argument is strongly represented by Howard Becker and the arguments of hierarchy of credibility and so on. And that was part of the sociological background to the sociology of science. It was sociology, the least credible discipline, as evidenced here by the fact of no mention, so applied to the most credible actors, scientists. So that was a powerful message within the sociology of science, that this was a way of looking at credibility and whose positions counted. And the argument that Becker made was, if you put forward that view, you would render yourself non-credible. And that's what one sees through in terms of the hierarchies among disciplines and so on. So there's quite an important argument there. But within sociology itself...
But isn't that an argument for not talking about sociology?
Sorry?
Isn't that an argument for not talking
But it's
about
then
sociology?
interesting about why one would not talk about sociology in the context of epistemological justice, when it is in itself, and the position of the sociology of science has been subject to those kinds of moves made against it.
Yeah, but see, you're dwelling on the past here, I think.
No. Well, this is obviously about what you're saying about the past and reparation and so on. But if one thinks within sociology, the symmetry position within sociology is that there's a point of view of the observer and there's a point of view of the subject. And the task of the observer is to represent the point of view of the subject. And there's an implicit assumption. Well, I'm just saying,
Okay.
there's an implicit assumption that the point of view of the observer is an adequate representation of the point of view of the subject. But the symmetry principle would require the agreement between the observer and the subject.
That's not obvious.
Well, and there's a frequent disagreement, and that disagreement goes back to the original version of the symmetry argument.
Yeah.
That is, when subjects disagree with us as observers, we describe them as subjective, us as objective, them as falsely conscious, us as properly conscious as well. And that was the originating position that David Bloor was attacking. And so I think you can't really get into what the Strong program was trying to do without starting to address the nature of the sociology.
Look, okay, if we were to do this ancient history, it's true that but it's 50 years, more than 50 years ago now. Well, look, the thing is, it is true that the symmetry principle was suggested against the spirit of, let's say, grounded theory. Okay, grounded theory, if you know about this, Anselm Strauss, Barry Glaser, these characters, right. The idea was to use the categories of the agents, right, basically, as to do your ethnographies. Symmetry principle is against that. Okay, that's pretty clear, right? And it's not committed to portraying the agents in an especially sympathetic light. It's trying to do justice to them, right? It's trying to do justice, but doing justice to someone doesn't mean that you're their mouthpieces, right? And so it is trying to establish a clearly independent point of view. Now, I understand the grounded theory people, they had a kind of axe to grind with regard to two things. One of them is Talcott Parsons and this idea of a superordinate theoretical orientation that kind of disregarded what the agents thought about themselves, and also the institutionalization of deviance, right, and mental asylums and hospitals and all this kind of jazz that these people were into, right, that there's a sense in which grounded theory was giving those people voice, okay? But symmetry principle is not about that, right? It's even though it's dealing with agents on the ground, right, it doesn't have that vibe going for it. It really is trying to do something independent from the agents. And I don't think, is there a need to make an apology for that?
I wasn't making any apology, observing that there is an issue of the adequacy of the descriptions.
To what?
Okay.
Adequacy to what? What is the goal here? This is the point. What is the goal here, right? When you're doing sociology or, and you know, I mean, I think there's an open question when you're doing any kind of social science about what the goal is, right? And the goal has to be something that is theoretically and methodologically specified. And the extent to which, let's say, the various agents' voices need to be represented, I think it's kind of relative to the goal of the enterprise you're engaged in. And you might think that certain enterprises are morally better than others. That's a fair argument to have. But it seems to me there's no absolute notion of adequacy here, at least as far as I understand.
Well, I wasn't there. What I was saying is that we've been discussing the strong program of sociology of science without any of the concepts and understandings of the strong program
Yeah, but
of
this
the
is-
sociology.
Yeah, but part of what I'm saying here, right, part of the whole premise of my talk is that this is dead, right? At a certain level, the sociology of scientific knowledge is dead. STS itself might be dead. And what we're in the scavenger business. I mentioned this in the beginning of my talk, right? We are here to resurrect, right, and to revive what is valuable in this stuff because there's no going back to it. And yeah, you can, you know, we can take these trips down memory lane, but the point is that it's not going to get us going forward in the future, given the world we live in, which is quite a different world from the one that was happening in the late 1970s. I mean, that's all I'm saying, right? I'm not committed to fidelity to what Bloor originally had in mind. Right? And frankly, Bloor's a smart guy, and I bet he would say, go for it, as far as I'm concerned. Right? So in other words, he's not in the museum business. He's not in the business of preserving the strong program in the sociology of scientific knowledge. What I'm sure he would want to see is that we take the concepts that are valuable and translating them into a new context where they can be powerful. And that is what I'm trying to do.
The problem is that either within STS and outside it in social sciences, symmetry means a lot of things.
I know.
And for me, for instance, in what you said, symmetry seemed to me too static. Finding one's position is movement all the time. I mean, in the notion of distance, there is this strange thing known to anthropologists very well, that it is actually distance, two stances. You are outside and far away, and you are very close and in it. And moving between, I mean,
No, but you have to discipline that.
You have to always move somehow.
And you have to discipline the movement.
Yes, and you surely know how, for instance, Dick Pels has
Oh, sure, Dick
written
Pels, yeah,
about
in the Netherlands.
the symmetry principle.
Yeah.
Noticing, and this is not about whether it is whether Bloor meant it that way or another way, but he argued quite reasonably to me that Peter mentioned the phrase 50-50, but he said, no, being symmetrical in our sense doesn't mean to be in the precise absolute center, because it is a nonsensical task. It means actually not to do certain things. It means trying to avoid situations where you are too much standing with one of the parties involved. So it is a much more pragmatic and dynamic approach toward justice is not, things are not just or unjust, unjust. They happen to be just and unjust. The constructivism, which again, there is probably no other term in social sciences associated with so many misunderstandings and mismatches between different camps. It's not one thing, but the constructivists view should also be applied not only to scientific truth, for instance, but also to the term of justice, which seemed to me relatively downplayed in what you said.
Well, and the justice wasn't downplayed. I mean, in fact, symmetry is not normally associated with justice.
Of justice.
Oh, the constructivism, that's another matter. I'm not going to speak on their behalf, but I think see, when you talk about all this dynamism, I think you're sort of imagining yourself as the anthropologist or whatever who's moving around a site and dealing with different people and stuff like that. But I think where you can start to appreciate the sort of thing I'm talking about, the static thing, as you call it, is when you're actually writing about it.
Yes.
Okay? When you're writing about it. And look, I don't know what the hell Bruno Latour was doing in San Diego in those labs when he was washing out test tubes or anything, but the writing about it creates the distance. That's where the distance happens, okay? And so the figuring out of how you're going to write about it, how you're going to talk about the various parties, that's what I'm talking about here.
True, but how you behave in the field does not really allow you to write anything.
I guess you have tenure already. I mean,
it often depends upon very subtle selection of words. Writing in a way one would classify as symmetric, but actually, what you do in the field and what you write afterwards, these cannot be really separated.
Look. I really think about this from the stand. So imagine a court case, right? A case gets brought to trial. All kinds of stuff already happened, right? And you know, some of it was observed, not observed, whatever. And then it all gets remobilized and it gets brought to the court. And then the judge has to kind of figure it out. And then he writes a verdict, right? He writes a text that sort of lays out what the situation is here and why he decides the way he does. Well, that's in a sense how you need to think about what the anthropologist or anyone else is doing is like the judge in this regard, right? Because all kinds of stuff is happening. And while it's going on, you may have access to certain things and not other things. I mean, you know, all these ethnographers are not just writing about stuff they saw directly, right? They're writing about things they heard about and so forth, and they provide very kind of measured judgments about these things. And in a sense, the credibility of their accounts has to do with the way in which they're able to balance kind of the evidence that they receive. So it's not about what happens before it gets into the courtroom. Yes, there's going to be all kinds of stuff that happens that has to be dealt with and so forth. But it's what we're talking about here is how the stuff is written up, right? That is really what we're talking about. And the symmetry isn't, it's not how you look at it at the time.
Yeah.
You know, it's happening.
It's not only.
You know, I mean, I don't see how you could be symmetrical in that sense of just looking at stuff. I mean, so it's not literally like a quantum mechanics experiment, right? But the point is, it's when you actually write the stuff up, right, that the symmetry can then be imposed.
Yeah, but why then in STS would one's important strategy to achieve a symmetric position would be to study ongoing controversies? I mean, if this would be irrelevant and everything depended only on afterward writing about it, why this would be important?
Well, because this is where the art comes in, right? Because the art of the, I mean, so STS can capture very well, I mean, you know, when it's done well, these kinds of ongoing things in a way that appears symmetrical. I mean, actually, you know, something like Leviathan and the air pump is pretty good at doing that kind of thing, right? Because there's a kind of ongoing controversy, right, between Hobbes and the Royal Society, and it's being kind of played out in various ways. And you know, it's not obvious as you read the book that in fact Hobbes was going to lose, right? I mean, you may know that already because you know something about history, right? But the point is, from the book itself, you don't get that impression, right? And at the end, of course, the way it's presented is, you know, Hobbes's loss, not being admitted into the Royal Society, is kind of contingent, right? In other words, it could have gone another way. There's no reason to think just based on the arguments that he had to lose, right? And there's a kind of art to creating that level of plausibility, right? That in fact that the side that lost could have won, right? And that is kind of maintaining a kind of symmetry throughout the narrative, right?
I understand, yet I think that it is important to understand the principle of symmetry originating in sociology of science, together with understanding the situation this principle was called for originally. I mean, as you said, sociology of science in the times of Bloor wanted to be a science of science. It is really, I mean, and in this way, it is another name for neutrality, a quite usual scientific requirement.
Yes.
But the problem is that when you study science by scientific means, it is really a precarious situation.
Sure.
Because scientific results define what is truth, and then all the situation becomes completely redefined after scientific result becomes established. So it really and then it is not really standing with those or those, but it really means to be prepared to take the results of scientific effort cautiously. And not to become too.
Well, look, court
gripped
cases can
by
be
it.
reversed, right? I mean, court cases can be reversed. There are courts of appeal. There's no reason to think that whatever decision is taken at the moment is the final decision forever and ever,
Yes.
right? I mean, you know, so
And
no
I
disagreement.
agree that a lot happens during writing. It very much depends on rhetorics,
That's right.
on subtle ways you name things.
That's right.
But I believe it all depends on much more things than writing, and as I said, writing depends on all those other things, on what how you approach the phenomena in the empirical field. So and once you admit this, something like symmetry deserves relatively pragmatic approach, what it means, and seeing that it is something that is being achieved and not something which somehow is and is given.
Okay.
I have like 3-part question, but I will try to make it simple. How does the field that studies, like STS that studies epistemic justice, how is it related to the kind of Bourdieu idea of multiple capitals that you can have? And like, would these people or would you be comfortable with claiming that, I don't know, access or the ability to produce scientific knowledge in the broadest sense, is it just a part of cultural capital? Because when it is, I think then the question of epistemic justice is quite easy, and in principle you can apply Rawls ethics. Because it's about the distribution of cultural capital that is non-rival, which makes some things specific, and then it's about the communication between levels, right? Like individual level and group level. And
That's something, I mean, I haven't.
In Bourdieu's perspective.
In Bourdieu's perspective, of course, but it's like the wealth being rival or capital being rival is a scale, right? And it is not rival in the same sense as a plot of land is. It is not. It can be reproduced much more easily than an acre of arable land. So I'm not buying into that it's rival in the same sense.
Well, I mean, I think, but usually when we talk about the rivalry stuff, it's about the extent to which you can put up barriers, not by how easy it can be produced, right? But it's whether you can put up barriers to people's access to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The rivalry of epistemic access or of cultural capital is itself a product of other processes. Like this is like the rivalry of arable land is non-questionable, non-negotiable. but the society itself can decide based on some principles of
I see.
epistemic justice how rival you actually make some aspects of cultural
Okay,
capital. right?
okay, I see what you're saying. I think there is a problem there. Do you know this idea of positional goods? Are you
Yeah.
familiar with this from this guy Hirsch, economist, British economist? And the idea is that if you do have this kind of situation where the goods are available to everyone, that the relative value will drop.
Oh yeah.
So in a sense, you get the problem on the other side.
Yeah. But you can produce, let's say, more accurate models of the world,
Mhm.
which ultimately, like the ability to predict out of sample data, is ultimately, I would say, the function of science, or that's the product, the predictive accuracy, right? And you can get more predictive accuracy about whatever, right? Markets currently are unpredictable because some people are able to predict them quite accurately, and they like harvest the predictability. But
Right.
not all things, like natural phenomena, are not like that, right? Like they do not react in this like chaos 2 way. So you can produce more science, you can produce more predictive accuracy, and then we can ask, in the same lines with Rawls, what is the optimal distribution of knowledge in our society that produces the fastest growth of predictive accuracy, right? Because then more people have like more knowledge, because that's the
Yeah.
utility function, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is that the optimal distribution, in the same sense as Rawls is talking about, like, let's say, the economic capital, the optimal distribution for the fastest growth may not be uniform distribution, right?
Right.
And there is evidence that it is not, because when you have one society where everybody has the access to the same infinite library, it will produce less innovation than smaller communities that are only connected with like more long links, right? Because they don't get stuck on local optima. So, and then it's a question whether these communities should have access to libraries of the same size, just not the same libraries.
Yeah.
And then, in my opinion, this is an empirical question.
Yeah.
And I think this is good about Rawls, because he basically transfers moral dilemma into empirical questions by defining a good evaluation function of what do we want, right?
Yeah. I gotta say, I mean, I agree with you, but it reminds me a lot of Condorcet. You know, the Marquis de Condorcet had kind of, in terms of these global kind of aspirations that you're talking about with knowledge and so forth. But this is not a criticism. It's just, you know, yeah, if we want to reinvent the Enlightenment.
Yeah,
Exactly.
They got something right.
Yeah. No, I'm not denying it. We just can't fill in the details here. Come on, is there someone online maybe?
Yeah, there was a question online.
I mean, you forgot about those guys, come on.
We usually forget about them pragmatically because they get too complicated. But there is one question. I'm not sure if it makes sense because it relates to something that happened already during the talk.
Oh, that's good.
And the point was, okay, I will read the whole question or comment by Petr Žemla. Speaking of reparations, or let's use word restitutions here.
Yeah.
In our case, even symbolical recognition of injustice makes difference. That's basically the main point. It's not about full compensation, it's much more complicated. If you do the dirty work on specific cases here, there is more in psychological impact. See recovery on families who got recognition of their suffering. It is still a hot topic in debate due to our historical experience with Nazi and consequent communist totalitarianism, not just generally in principles, but also, and in my opinion, more importantly, in case of specific observers who can't abstract away from their life.
Yeah. Well, look, this is Okay, so my view about this is, okay, this is gonna be really controversial, and we're getting close to the end of the 2 hours, but yes. I think with a lot of this reparation stuff, so okay, so a lot of the comment there I could see related to the people who, let's say, lived during what was the transition period, right? From the past to the present. I think I'm not saying there's not a problem there. But I think the interesting question from the standpoint of policy is the extent to which future generations, how one is to teach the past to the future generations who did not directly experience these things for which reparations have been demanded. And my view, generally speaking, is that we should not be reproducing, as it were, injury of the past in the future.
Mhm.
Right. So I do think that over time, there has to be a kind of normalization of the history in some sense for the younger generation. So in other words, the reparations mentality, insofar as it exists. So I think, and this is why I quoted the John Elster transitional justice thing, right? His argument, which I agree with him on, is that basically transitional justice works best if the people who perpetrate the crimes are around and you can deal with them, and the people to whom the crimes were perpetrated are around and you can deal with them, right? So South Africa works, right? Because as it were, apartheid happened till the very end. The people who were committing the apartheid basically were the ones who turned over the power, right? So it works in that context. The problem becomes when we're talking about so-called historical reparations that go back, decades or hundreds of years and so forth, because as a result of what the success story, I would say, in South Africa is now there is a kind of a reparations epidemic, where all kinds of people are claiming reparations for everything. And it seems to me that this is really, from the standpoint of future orientation, is really a bad way to go, okay? So in a sense, the idea of transitional justice has to be understood as a very contemporary, about the contemporary world. And that's where the issues need to be resolved. They are not something to carry on generation after generation. This is my view. And I think this basically what Elster's view is, and he does a kind of cross-national study of these kinds of issues. That's my view.
Yeah, good. There are two more questions.
Sure.
I'm not sure if we have time for both, but Sasha Lee Smith was first. Sasha, you can unmute yourself and tell us your question. No. Because they should hear us through here. Okay. Okay. Oh, it won't let me unmute. Okay, so you can unmute her. This is a precautionary implementation based on previous experience.
Yeah. Yes.
With Zoom bombers.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, Zoom up.
Oh, hi, great. It's always a struggle with these sort of hybrid things that we do. Hi, thank you for the talk. It was great. I just have a question in relation to how much your framing of these debates relates to what is epistemic about epistemic justice. So you mentioned this idea about sort of blindness in relation to the prejudice position. But I wonder how much of this is just sort of theories of justice as opposed to theories of epistemic justice, because epistemic justice isn't necessarily only a distributive issue. And then in relation to that, I wanted to know if it does deal with theories of epistemic justice, does it deal specifically with the prejudice model of epistemic justice? Or if we look at it more in like a structural way, how do we move beyond the prejudice model of epistemic injustice or dealing with epistemic injustice as opposed to just social inequality and social injustices?
Okay, let me see if I can answer this in short compass, but feel free. But feel free to ask a follow-up on this. My notion of epistemic justice, and in fact, this is one of the ways in which it's different from Miranda Fricker and these other people, is I believe we need a theory of epistemic justice is a kind of theory of justice, right? So we're talking about first principles here. So there is a sense in which the way in which one's going to be thinking about the principles of justice, in my sense, is going to be kind of structural. Okay, and when you say, is it, you know, anything other than distributive, I'm kind of wondering what you take the alternative to be here, because in a sense, I do see the my approach to epistemic justice as being distributive. I do see that. I'm just wondering what you take to be the alternative is to, so I can get a clear sense of where you're coming from on this.
Right. So I guess, are we talking about issues of like distributive? Are we distributing power? Are we distributing knowledge? I think a lot of people would.
This guy, I don't know, I forgot. Yeah, this guy and I, we've been going on about this because I do think it is a kind of knowledge issue, especially if we think about knowledge, not just simply in the sort of basic sense of having access to it, but in terms of credibility, right? Because part of what needs to be redistributed is credibility among different forms of knowledge. And in that sense, I'm not in disagreement with kind of the spirit of what Miranda Fricker is trying to do. It's just that it's difficult to figure out what the proper distribution is unless you have some kind of prior theory about how credibility ought to be assigned, right? So you need a kind of way of valuing knowledge, right? You need a theory of how knowledge is valued. And I don't think you can just rely on the intuitions of what is bad to give you that, right? That there's a sense in which what kind of knowledge has what kind of credibility and what kinds of circumstances. I think we need a theory that actually covers that. And my objection to somebody like Miranda Fricker is, I think she presumes we kind of already know this. And I don't think we do know this. I think we're just really just trading on intuitions that a certain kind of politically like-minded people happen to agree on. But I don't think
Right.
you see that's so I do think there's a sense in which we need to go back to fundamentals on this.
I think, sorry, if I can just sort of add to what you've said.
No,
I
go
think
ahead.
there's a lot of discourse sort of around, it was mentioned a little bit earlier on in the talk about the difference between sort of and intercommunal collective resources and the distribution of that in relation to something called epistemic appropriation. And I think this sort of relates a little bit to what you've said, but there is a lot of discourse beyond Miranda Fricker and what she says about epistemic injustice and about epistemic justice in relation to it being a virtue of social institutions. So I think potentially a view of epistemic justice in relation to Fricker is potentially a little bit unkind, but that there is discourse that relates to a lot more of what's going on here that I guess could be of worth in these discussions.
Okay, so look, when we go back to Rawls, right, part of what Rawls was trying to do with this theory of justice was to create just institutions, right? And so we might think about these just epistemic institutions in a kind of similar vein, right, of these things that you seem to be referring to. So I'm certainly not against that, right? I mean, and so maybe I need to look at that literature a little bit more, but I don't think I'm against that exactly. But I do think that the epistemic injustice literature tends to be very much, what can I say, sort of blame shifting or, blame attributing. It tends to end up in that kind of mode, which I think doesn't get us very far with regard to any kind of theory of justice. Right. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, because look,
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Sasha.
wherever you are.
No. There is one more question. I think you can address Steve. You can send him an email or follow up or whatever. We should go to lunch. And so thank you again for.
Thank you.
Thank you.